Hello and welcome to Coachability Foundation webinar series. Let's wait a couple of seconds for attendees to join us, and then we will start shortly. So hello again and welcome to Coachability Foundation's webinar series. I'm Gulnar, your host today during this webinar. Coachability Foundation is a non-profit organization based in The Hague, Netherlands, with the aim of supporting female entrepreneurs here in Europe and abroad. The purpose of this webinar series is to share experience of female entrepreneurs in different parts of the world, their challenges, as well as opportunities they are facing today, and in this respect to inform and inspire existing and future entrepreneurs. Today, our topic is dedicated to female entrepreneurs in fragile environments and how empowering women in these countries may have beyond economic benefits. Our guest speaker is Dr. Ritchie. She is joining us from Nairobi. Dr. Ritchie is a postdoc research fellow at ISS, International Institute for Social Studies of Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Also, she is gender and enterprise advisor at RVO, Netherlands Enterprise Agency. So before giving the floor to Dr. Ritchie, I would like to tell shortly about the structure of today's webinar. So first, we'll start with a short video that our communication team prepared about accomplishment of our guest expert. Then Dr. Ritchie will deliver her presentation that will last about 30 minutes. We may have 2 to 3 minutes of discussion after her presentation that will follow by Q&A session. But you can also post your questions and comments during and after Dr. Ritchie's presentation in the Q&A section below your screen. So let's start with the short video about Dr. Ritchie's professional profile.
Dr. Ritchie has a background in international development, market development, and finance. Her PhD focused on grassroots women's enterprise in Afghanistan and cultural change. She won Best Paper at the International Symposium on Entrepreneurship and Innovation in 2012 for an article based on one of her PhD case studies. Her recent academic research includes work with Somali and Syrian women entrepreneurs in fragile refugee situations in urban Kenya and Jordan. Alongside her academic work, Holly also works as a development consultant focusing on gender, enterprise, value chains, and livelihood security, with specific country-based experience in Afghanistan for 10 years, Kenya for 6 years, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, the Middle East, and Brazil. Recent assignments include the development of gender profiles for Somali and Sudan under the African Development Bank and UN Women. She further acts as a gender and enterprise advisor for the Netherlands Enterprise Agency across the Horn of Africa and the Middle East. Complementing her academic and consulting work, in 2018, Holly set up a social enterprise in Kenya, Thrive, that aims to support the capacity building of female aid workers, consultants, and researchers, with profits channeled into pro bono training of Somali refugee women. Dr. Holly Ritchie has a strong interest in institutions, gender, inclusion, and innovation in fragile economic development. Her research and work has looked in particular at poor women's enterprise participation and marginalized conflict and refugee settings. She focuses on social inclusion in business and value chains and looks ahead to social outcomes from economic empowerment.
So now we're gonna join with Dr. Holly Ritchie. Hello and welcome, Dr. Ritchie.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay from that side.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. And I would like to start by saying good afternoon to everybody from here in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm really so thrilled that we can gather participants from different countries in the world. I gather some people are joining from Greece, perhaps Spain, also on this continent in Africa. So it really is so exciting to be able to have this platform. And thank you to Coachability for inviting me to speak today. And it's really my honor to share some of my insights related to women entrepreneurs in more difficult or fragile settings. And here I'll just start by clarifying what I mean by fragility. So often we think of fragile states, and we think of states with perhaps weak or weak governance at a sort of an overarching level. When I talk about fragile environments, I'm really talking about at a local level where the state might be weak in that environment, or absent, or even unwilling to provide basic services such as education and health and security. And so this can also include slum settings as well as conflict areas and more marginalized environments. Before I begin the presentation, just to clarify again, so I work as a consultant in gender, culture and economic development based here in Nairobi, and also work as an academic with research very much specific to those themes, and looking very particularly at these fragile or more marginalized contexts and what that means for women in enterprise. And recently I then put some of this into practice by setting up a social enterprise to really try to, in a way, channel some of those lessons learned and also test and let's say, explore some of those understandings and insights and learn further about those contexts by setting up a very small project outside of Nairobi here in Kenya. So now I'll start by sharing my screen for the presentation. Okay, so I've entitled the presentation today, Appreciating Women Entrepreneurs in These Fragile Settings. And what I'd like to emphasize is going beyond business as usual, not just in the way that business is done, but perhaps in the outcomes of that business and business experience. So a little overview of the presentation today. Initially, we will look at the global situation of women and the economy. Then I will look at some of the what I call institutional obstacles that influence women's economic participation and development. Then we'll discuss some of the typical NGO approaches that are used for facilitating women's enterprise development and business participation. Then I will turn to some of my empirical research, academic and through the consulting work, into Islamic women's enterprise development in more perhaps difficult and conservative settings. And we will look specifically at one example, which I take from my PhD research in Afghanistan. It is an extreme example, but there are lessons learned from Afghan women about some of the experiences of participating in business and what it means for their life and opportunities. Then I will try to pull together some social, inverted commas, lessons learned in women's enterprise development in these more difficult settings, and distill some of these cultural insights for women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And finally, we will reflect on the impact of women entrepreneurs in fragile contexts. And there is a final part of this, which hasn't come out, I can see on the screen, and it's looking at the situation of COVID-19, so what it means for this current crisis for women in entrepreneurship. So starting with the global situation of women and the economy. I don't have to tell you that in many countries in the world, women face discrimination, participating in business, in the marketplace, and constrained development. In fact, their discrimination influences many dimensions of their lives, socially, economically, politically, in terms of access, of course, to different spaces in which they're able to participate, different types of work from an economic perspective, where they might work, and of course, access to services and resources, even including land, for example, in agriculture. And as I say, the opportunities in work and otherwise. And it's been said that economically, women are actually across the world, but perhaps more so in developing countries, are, and I cite here, disadvantaged on almost every indicator in the world of work. That includes earnings, so the potential money they can make, the quality of their employment, including protection in the workplace, the status of that employment and level of uncertainty, and the scope of that participation. And of course, these all matter for development and healthy human societies. So here I cite actually a recent report by the World Economic Forum that really brings it home, the situation of global gender parity related to women in the economy. And you can see here, it will be almost 257 years globally before women can participate on an equal basis to men in the economy. And this is further influenced by dynamics such as the fact that women inhabit roles, or let's say types of work that are now being automated, for example, in services, manufacturing, clerical work. Few women are entering professions where wage growth is most pronounced, including in technology. And of course, women face the perennial problem of insufficient care, so childcare infrastructure and access to capital. All of those dynamics influence the speed of which we will reach global gender parity. Globally, just over half of women are engaged in the labour market, and this is opposed to almost 80% of men. So another indicator of women's, the differences between men and women in the labour market. And almost 72 countries, women are barred from opening bank accounts or obtaining credit. So another indicator of women's discrimination in the marketplace. However, today I'd like to look more deeply at some of the, what I call institutional obstacles that influence women's economic participation. So on the one hand, in many developing countries, there is an absence or poor implementation of formal democratic institutions and laws. And in such cases, society then is shaped by what I call informal institutions, traditional norms and customs that are often embedded in a patriarchal mindset, as well as religious beliefs that drive really ideas about what men and women can do. And such norms and dynamics are really exacerbated in situations of poverty where there's a lack of education, so a lack of understanding about gender and equality, but also a lack of resources to do things differently. And a situation of local fragility where I've talked about the weak state structures being able to provide protection and security, the low levels of trust in such situations and insecurity. And all of these dynamics influence the scope of women's roles, so economic roles, rights, and even entitlements, e.g., for example, access to resources, inheritance practices, and so forth and so on. In this slide, I'm just highlighting for us to really understand what drives these norms, these practices, are some attitudes and beliefs about women and girls. And this really is, in a way, the foundation of many of our cultures. And some of them are positive. So women and girls should be honored and protected. And they therefore belong at home. A man is the breadwinner. Women are carers. Boys are, inverted commas, worth more than girls, perhaps because they inherit. Technology is complicated work and should only be for men. Men should be in charge of big business. Women can do petty business. And these are some of the, let's say, ideas that shape our current practices and attitudes related to women in the economy. So we now look at some of the typical NGO approaches that have been formulated to try to support women's engagement in enterprise. And this has been particularly an important program for many NGOs in the last 20 years. So, for example, supporting women's networking, engagement and participation, for example, in cooperatives, associations, very specifically, the Indian model of the self-help groups and village and savings and lending associations that are savings and credit groups that go beyond that and support group enterprise, women's collective action, and of course, access to market actors and services and resources. Connected to the self-help groups and the VSLAs are support for women to access formal microfinance, for example, microloans, and small and medium enterprise loans to support the start or the growth of business ventures. And thirdly, of course, NGOs have endeavored to support technical and business skills development, to support the necessary skills for products and services and for the growth of the business itself. So we turn actually now to looking more deeply at some of the cultural norms and dynamics that are really shaping women's participation in business, to really try to look more deeply at what is going on in terms of women's engagement in business and in markets. And here we're going to look at some of my empirical research into Islamic women's enterprise development. So my PhD research in Afghanistan really tried to dig down and look at some of these cultural issues and also try to understand where grassroots enterprise development had taken place, and looking very deeply at women's participation in SMEs, so small and medium enterprises. Later research with Somali, Syrian, and Sudanese women, including refugees and then urban middle class, has looked further at culture, women's business, and entrepreneurship to really try to understand gender, these cultural norms, and enterprise in more diverse and fragile and conservative environments, building on my PhD research in Afghanistan. Today, we'll look at the case study of my PhD research of Afghan women in business to really try to understand some of the constraints that they faced, how they overcame those constraints, and what it meant for them to engage in business and enterprise. And perhaps there are lessons for all of us, even from this extreme setting. So I'll talk you through this case study. So with the support of a local NGO, in fact, not a foreign NGO, village women in west of Afghanistan were initially mobilized into groups of 20, so 20 women together, and eventually across a network of groups across 40 villages, so 800 women, to participate initially in women's self-help groups, so savings and credit groups, and then eventually in collective food processing business, making, for example, tomato paste and jams and chutney at the village level, but selling them both at the local level, but also at the city level. However, this was not an easy feat to engage with, to mobilize the women and to facilitate their engagement in each village. Initially, there was huge opposition to women's training and also later business participation. And this was due to constraints around women's public mobility, around showing their face to non-family men, and beliefs, deeper beliefs about women's roles in and beyond the household. So at this stage in the project for the local NGO that was trying to support the business development, there was an absolute pause on the project because of just a standstill at the local level, an absolute opposition to women's engagement in, first of all, the training, but at a much more difficult level in business. And so at this stage, there was careful and very, very extensive engagement with families and religious leaders that went on for almost a year. And this was really the subject of my PhD, so I can refer you to read on and hear more about that. Anyway, eventually some of the villages were mobilized, and it turned out that mobilized women in some villages could also help mobilize women in new villages. It was almost that they could then believe that women could do such activities if they could see that a neighboring village was doing the same thing. So in the course of this research, I understood and learned that eventually there was agreement at the village level for women to engage in the training and for them to engage at different levels of the business. But this required constant renegotiation of those boundaries, and for different women, which women were involved in the marketing, who was the business leader, what about the rules for women just engaged in the food processing, so as members of the group. With various setbacks due to insecurity, rumors in the village about what the women were doing, and so forth and so on. But the mobilized women in each of these groups were passionate about their business participation and their small empowerment in these small groups at the village level. And they especially were emphasizing how it was so important that they were managing to engage in business, but they still stayed within their culture. And here I emphasize this point because, in fact, with that extensive negotiation with religious leaders, with community leaders, with the families in those communities, it meant that those boundaries could be extended, but there could be community acceptance in that process. Eventually, the heads of these groups at the village level, in some cases, emerged to be what I call social entrepreneurs, motivated to support women and girls beyond the business, to support their rights to education, to reduce incidences of child marriage. So as if the participation and empowerment economically had galvanized them to look beyond their economic lives and to look closer at their social lives. Here I draw a quote from Jacqueline Novogratz, who's a very well-known social entrepreneur and founder of the CEO of Acumen, a venture capitalist fund that also worked in Rwanda with women in business from poor communities. And she highlighted this: the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but dignity. And this really resonated with me and the women, because yes, whilst they had become economically empowered and they had raised the incomes in their household, something greater was happening around their sense of themselves, their self-confidence, their voices in their community, and of course, their human dignity. So I'd like to draw together from my research, in fact, across the various contexts, some what I call social lessons learned in women's enterprise development in more difficult settings. And I emphasize here about new attitudes and connections amongst women in the community, and a sense of their agency, so their power to do things and to be able to act in their lives. And there are several points I'd like to raise here. So the first point, in such difficult settings, a major social lesson learned has been the importance of engaging with families and communities, including community leaders and religious leaders, which is absolutely critical and vital for local social acceptance, and fostering or opening up new narratives about what women can do and what they can't do. And then, of course, unleashing women's dignity. Beyond economics, these networks and associations that have been often formulated or supported to enable collective business have also enabled or fostered a new cooperation between women, a sense of solidarity between women, exchange and support, in addition to their business venture. And a third sort of social point, beyond business, a very important phenomenon I noticed in extreme settings was that some entrepreneurs, not all entrepreneurs, but some women entrepreneurs that had come from very difficult settings, became highly motivated to go beyond the business, to support community problem solving, peacemaking, and even engage in social activism towards either campaigning for their legal rights as refugees, or in the setting of Somali women in Kenya, or engaging, as with the Afghan women, to try to campaign for women's rights to education and reduce incidences of child marriage. So it's important to look beyond just the income that's generated, the economic empowerment, and understand what is happening when women might be economically empowered and how this influences their social and human lives. So distilling some of the insights from my research and work with women entrepreneurs in such settings, it is absolutely clear that women's economic barriers are not just rooted in finances or a lack of skills or challenges in marketing. We have to appreciate what I call culturally embedded economies, so that our economies are actually, of course, embedded in our society and the cultures and our culture. For women in very strict and conservative Islamic contexts, participation in external work is difficult. It can be challenging with such restrictions on their mobility and public interaction, and perhaps limited access to resources. When we understand such culturally embedded economies, we also appreciate that in risky contexts, there can be an increased nervousness from families that might lead to a clampdown on women's work, influencing their engagement or their choice of the different types of work, the location of the work, and the conditions of that work. So what are the consequences, as we've mentioned today, of these restrictions and dynamics for women entrepreneurs? Well, as we've mentioned, women entrepreneurs face challenges in gaining family and community acceptance and support. They face challenges in choosing the type and location of their business and breaking into male-dominated domains. They also face challenges in access to networks, markets, services, and resources. Yet, as we've learned today, there are critical social tools of change. This includes working with families, community leaders, religious leaders, with a particular emphasis on bringing in men and boys into the discussion. So the lesson here is that local attitudes can be overcome around women's roles and restrictions, and particularly through awareness raising. And perhaps, for example, drawing on progressive religious messages. For example, in the Quran, Prophet Muhammad's wife, first wife, was a business lady, and local proverbs. And understanding that to try to gain social acceptance, relationship building is absolutely critical. And secondly, when we think about working in the community, we need to draw on role models, female role models, and champions that can be instrumental in gaining acceptance from different levels of the community and other communities. A second point is that we know from work with NGOs that women's networks are critical. But what I have found in my research, that it's not only the network, but also members or leaders of those networks that can be change makers, going beyond business, to be social activists, to try to campaign for women's greater rights, women and girls' greater rights and opportunities. And finally, in my research, a really important area is the growing role of what's called ICT, so information communication technologies. And here we're most commonly talking about the mobile phone and such devices that can facilitate women's business through phone conversations, exchange, also through mobile money, for example, here in Kenya with M-Pesa. So that allows them to send money to suppliers, to be able to receive money without having to travel and leave their families. So it gives them an opportunity to do business, if you like, remotely. And here is a quote from IMF Christine Lagarde. "When women do better, economies do better." So really what I'm saying here, as we reflect on the impact of women entrepreneurs, it isn't just a question of economic justice. It's really much more than that. It's about fostering women's broader human rights, to participate in the economy and beyond, their human dignity, their choice in their lives and livelihoods, and their opportunities to engage in work of their choice. It's also about, so as Christine Lagarde said, when women are engaged in the economy, economies do better. So it leads, in fact, to economic growth and development. And more broadly, of course, women's participation in the economy can lead to a more inclusive and balanced local community development and societies. And finally, as I've said in my research, that in a sense, unlocking women as entrepreneurs can unleash women social entrepreneurs as community change makers. So women's engagement in the economy is not just about them having the justice of being able to participate in work. It's about much more than that. It's about economies. It's about the growth of economies. It's about community development and inclusion, and it's about social activism. So finally, I wanted to highlight some challenges that are arising during this current pandemic, and perhaps new opportunities that might be emerging. From a business point of view, women entrepreneurs are often dominant in sectors such as services and small manufacturing and trade. So in fact, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women-led SMEs. And they have been, as I cite here, the hardest hit by the crisis to date. Yet beyond the direct impact, from a social perspective, women may also be disproportionately affected by their increasing household roles, with households being asked to stay at home, with household members being asked to stay at home, increased risks of gender-based violence, and in fact, increased burdens to earn an income, because the pandemic has shown that it disproportionately affects men's health more than women. So I emphasize here that gender-sensitive responses by both government and aid agencies are absolutely crucial, and they need to really consider women's unique needs, inverted commas, impact and perspectives. And I urge you to look at this link that looks at some of these insights related to the pandemic and women in business. From the World Bank, some of the responses that have come up to date have been to support women's, of course, women entrepreneurs' access to microcredit and MESO level financing, that's for SMEs, so slightly higher level financing, that can provide, in a way, a buffer to these women entrepreneurs that might be less likely than men to be able to access loans. There's also something around a type of training called a personal initiative training, which really can help entrepreneurs to be a little more proactive, and help them perhaps recover from this crisis. Here I urge you to look both at this blog, and I have a link that describes a little bit more about this personal initiative training. But in a sense, it goes beyond business training. It's about really building women's strengths to be problem solvers, enhancing their confidence, and helping them make the right decisions in business. Taking a broader perspective from my research, it seems to be that there's growing importance now on women really being able to move also into online business, and this being able to participate perhaps also remotely in women's networks. So for example, through WhatsApp groups, I can give you an example of that a bit later on related to my refugee work in Kenya. And linked to this, there's thus, for me, a great importance for women to be able to receive more training related to ICTs, and greater support for them to join and participate in business associations. So we've come to the end of my presentation. I hope most of you are still there. I look forward to hearing your questions for any discussion. And I include here, if this presentation is available for participants, just some resources that they may want to look up that could be useful for them, including in refugee contexts, in Afghanistan. And then I've included a link to the personal initiative training as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ritchie, for a very interesting presentation and also the case study that you have highlighted. So I was thinking about the work of Coachability Foundation and what you've talked about, how to change the local leaders' mindset, how to impact local leaders, convince them to engage more women in this kind of projects. I like the idea that we should speak to their language. We should speak from their perspective also, because sometimes entrepreneurship, women entrepreneurship, they consider as a values of East, not East but West. So they may not like it because it comes from West. They could have perception that this all comes from West and Western countries. It's not their culture, but I like the idea that we should find in their context, like you said in Quran and some proverbs, that it's possible and it is in their culture, so we should just make it visible to them. So in this respect, I have one question to you, that from the perspective of International Development Organization, as you mentioned, World Bank is now having a microcredit and a quasi-credit for SMEs for women in fragile environments. So do you think that there is overemphasis on access to finance, but not on these cultural barriers, these non-formal institutional barriers for women entrepreneurs?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Of course, what they have done recently is emphasize what I've called this personal initiative training, which tries to, in a way, combat women's lack of confidence, perhaps lack of business skills that you could argue, well, you know, men would face the same constraints starting a business, but perhaps in the family, the boys in the family might be closer to the father who's in business, and they learn those skills going along. So I think on one hand, that there is an evolution in understanding through an emphasis on such training. However, I think that, you know, as emphasized recently in a webinar, brilliant webinar by Care International, I've included this as one of the resources to look up. It took place last week. It's called it was entitled Women Mean Business. It was a global webinar. And they were really trying to distill some of their lessons learned. And a major lesson learned from Care International, of course, is the importance of working with men and boys. And what I mean here is engaging with them when they're trying to mobilize women in business, or even in different, let's say, aspects of their lives, whether women are being mobilized to be more involved in community decision-making. You can't work without engaging with men, because at the end of the day, that's half the picture, or half the society at the local level. And the men are the ones who, or the leaders, the male leaders, often the gatekeepers, in a sense, to community culture and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So how does a big institution or organizations, you know, let's say, integrate that into their approaches to women in business? Well, the answer is, of course, it's very hands-on. So a lot of local NGOs can be involved in such training processes. And in extreme environments such as Afghanistan, that doesn't happen overnight. You don't go in and do one training and it's all over. It might take a year. So in the case of that local NGO, what they actually did was they actually stopped the project. And on board in their organization, they actually had a hafiz, so a well-versed man in the Quran. And he spent a year working with the selected few communities at the beginning to really lay down a foundation of more progressive Islam. That's what they did. And that laid, in a way, the foundations for them to start the project, start mobilizing the women, because they had already spent the time that was needed to try to open up ideas about what women can do and what they can't do. Now, in many other settings, of course, it's not as difficult or conservative as Afghanistan. But I do believe that there are ways that media can be used strategically, local media, to support new ideas about women in business or otherwise. So whilst there may be a direct intervention of supporting women's access to finance, microfinance, SME loans, perhaps there can be a broader strategy of utilizing local media groups, for example, radio, and having radio programs, radio shows that really highlight women engaging in these new spheres through radio shows or radio dramas. And these can be enormously influential, particularly in places like Afghanistan. They have a program it's a BBC program called New Home, New Life. And this BBC program is watched by many communities now over many years, and it's been a great tool for introducing ideas around girls going to school, all sorts of other, let's say, sort of social norms. I'm not, I guess also perhaps more tricky issues like early marriage. But I think that we shouldn't discard these other broader tools that are not so direct, but they influence society in general.
Yeah, thank you. And if you could just end sharing your screen so that audience can see you again, please.
Share. Would you like me to?
Yeah, stop sharing your screen so
oh,
that
yeah.
we can see you, or
Stop.
you can open the video so that we can see you. So we are now seeing your screen only, the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I want to, oh yes, sorry, stop sharing this one. Okay. Yep, sorry, I've got it. Yes, apologies. And I'll put my screen back on again, start video.
Yeah, good. I agree with you that it will take a lot of time. So we cannot have it just with one project to change everything. And also the media is really now important, as you've shared that you have a WhatsApp group that you can share information with local women, and also all these media outlets can have gradual impact on the mindset of local population. So we have we can now start a Q&A session. We have in our chat section we have a few questions. So I will start with Ali's question. So she asks, given that some local women in these communities themselves thrive and foster these entrenched gender roles, what do you think can be done to erase these mindsets?
Very good question. Would you like me to take it straight away?
Yeah, I think. Do you want to do it by one by or?
Yes,
or...
of course.
Okay.
So in fact, I've just completed a major country profile for both Sudan and Somalia, a gender profile for those two countries. And in the process of that research, in both contexts, so in these contexts, very conservative ideas shape women's access to education, work, health, community decision-making, and so forth and so on. One of the major things that came out, of course, from that, yes, you have women that are what I call gatekeeper women too. They're not so interested in the development of other women. In fact, one of them also came up in my research in Afghanistan. And that's a very particular story. But really what the major issue here is education. And it's the type of education. So in the Sudanese research, we talked a lot, or what came out from the participants was in this new era, so post-revolution in Sudan, there's now a scrutiny about how to accelerate women's development and empowerment and equality in that context. Whilst in the urban settings, there is, let's say, more mobility of women. For many poorer women in that society, in many communities in Sudan and Somalia, women are constrained and face a great deal of discrimination in their lives. And so we talked a lot, or participants in the research talked a lot about looking at curriculums. So gender roles in the curriculum, rather than just talk about, I'll give you an example, when they have a sort of case study at school and it says Mohammed started a business, well, perhaps use Halima started a business. And so you start to change ideas through more progressive curriculums. So that's one way of doing it. Of course, for me, what's really crucial is really getting the religious leaders on board, because religious leaders in many of these very conservative settings are really, in a way, holding the reins on the culture. And so if you have progressive religious leaders, that some of these gatekeeper women will be, in a way, eventually will not be listened to in the same way. I can give you another story from my work with Somali women refugees here in Kenya. So the women were discussing or explaining to me that how their lives in displacement, so as forced refugees, now they're in Kenya, has of course completely changed their lives, but forced them also into roles that they weren't actually playing when they were in Mogadishu. Whilst women entrepreneurs are, or let's say petty traders, for example, are observed on the streets in Mogadishu, in different cities in Somalia, it's not an acceptable form of women's economic engagement to be on the street selling, etc., trading, so forth and so on. In the Kenyan, as in displaced, as the refugees, many of these women were forced to begin petty trading. And this was an enormous problem. So the community themselves, even though they realized that the women were only trading to support their families, and often they were single parents, the men in the community would intimidate them, but also the married women that didn't have to work, they would spit at them. So they were a bit like the gatekeepers, the ones holding on to the conservative gender roles. And in this case, of course, it's been really difficult, but a way that the women themselves have managed to, in a way, boost themselves if they've organized themselves into groups. So I'm a huge fan of women's collective organizations, so through self-help groups or through small business groups. And of course, yes, you may have dynamics within those groups. Some women might want to dominate and others have less voice. But they automatically allow women to at least have some form of collective support from each other, and perhaps move towards what I call collective agency. So ability to be able to act together, support each other. And in some cases, you may even find one or two of them become then very socially motivated. And I've talked about that in my research, and I call them trailblazers that want to be more activists. So yes, it's a complicated phenomenon, but there are such structures can, in a way, support women that face difficulties in the face of also more difficult women.
Yeah, indeed. So the next question is from Monsa, and she asks, how can civil society assist women entrepreneurs in fragile environments in a sustainable way?
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation, and particularly in what I call, well, in more conflict settings. So in Afghanistan, as a case in point, in such settings, civil society is active, but then their activities can be greatly diminished when a conflict is then, when there's let's say, conflict takes place again, and the communities become destabilized. But the role of civil society is absolutely critical in, for example, women's networks. So I talk a lot about associations, but we think of it more broadly in terms of networking and women's connections. So civil society is really the backbone to those networking opportunities, allowing women to be able to come together, even not necessarily just in women's organizations, but in mixed civil society groups, to be able to then promote, advocate for change. In both, well, particularly in Somalia, one of the great, let's say, sort of findings from the research related to the gender profile there was around this importance of the role of civil society. So it's not enough to have, let's say, new laws or new opportunities that are enshrined at that greater level. There's got to be a movement within the society itself, and civil society can play that role in driving or creating a women's movement for change. So you cannot underestimate or not or emphasize more strongly enough the importance of women's own movement in campaigning for change.
And in this sense, do you think that the local community may have, or civil society may have impact on the top level leaders or policymakers in this sense, in fragile environments?
That is, yes, is the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Of course, you know, such activities can be constrained in more extreme fragile environments. But, you know, I've emphasized they are a vital part of the equation in fostering that women's movement, in lifting those voices. In Sudan, it's been so crucial. Civil society engagement in driving forward change. They were suppressed during the last authoritarian regime, and now, in a sense, their day is coming. They're able to be more active again, and they're very vocal with that. So I had the fortune of working with one of the leaders of a civil society group in Sudan, a woman there, and she's really been pushing forward some of these, you know, trying to change laws, trying to overturn discriminatory laws. So the role of civil society, as I say, cannot be emphasized enough.
Yeah. I think also civil society, when doing these kind of projects, they should be careful, because sometimes when the policymakers are enraged by these projects, they can totally block all the roads for civil society. For example, I know that in Ethiopia, the government blocks civil society to get funding from abroad or from organizations that are not registered in the country.
That is correct.
Also, yeah, it's the case also.
And it happened in Sudan as well. A lot of, well, this was more foreign NGOs were expelled from Darfur several years ago because they campaigned too strongly on issues around GBV. So, of course, there's a careful, let's say, approach that one has to take, but as I say, it's just an incredibly important part of the movement of shifting norms and being able to open up opportunities for women and girls.
Yeah. There is another question from Monza, and she asks whether the situation with women and assisting women entrepreneur in Africa is better nowadays than in the last years.
You know, I think there's been a massive drive to support women entrepreneurship by aid agencies across the world, in fact, and particularly organizations. And I mentioned Care International, and there has been many lessons learned along the way about how to support women in business. So I feel like, you know, when I think back to, you know, a few decades ago, and some of the approaches that were still being tried and sort of, you know, tested. And I was actually part of, in Afghanistan, the organization I worked for at that point introduced self-help groups for the first time into the country. Self-help groups are one of the, I'd call one of the most successful approaches for being able to mobilize women and support their collective business and access to microfinance, perhaps through formal institutions, banks, etc. And there was much discussion about whether it would work. Now, this was back in 2005. And so the NGO that I work for was a British NGO and felt that, okay, well, let's try it here. It's been very successful in India. And of course that, the story at that point, across the world, self-help groups, village savings and lending associations, they're all similar structures around supporting women's economic empowerment through financial literacy, collective business, and access to services and markets. And so now it's a well-known approach. These, either the self-help group or the VSLA. So I think that's a big change from a few decades ago, that such approaches do exist. And they're not without their faults. There are, of course, there can be weaknesses if they haven't been facilitated in the right way. But what I have seen in now several countries, I've looked at VSLAs and self-help groups, I've just seen the enormous possibilities that they bring for women to participate in business, in small enterprise, and even to grow those enterprises. And that just cannot be underestimated. They have explained to me, and then of course they go beyond that. They say, whilst this has happened, now that we want to speak up in the community more, now we would like to, at home, we discuss a little bit more jointly with our husbands about the children's education. So you can see it unleashes different effects. So I think that, things have come along. And now that we've learned some of those lessons, I think more broader lessons are about, okay, let's not leave out men and boys. So whilst we've mobilized these women into self-help groups, VSLAs at a local level, now they've got little small businesses and petty trading, they still face issues around access to land. They still face issues around perhaps other access to other resources and services. And at this stage, of course, now that's why it's important to be able to broaden the conversation with men and boys.
Yeah. And we have a question and comment from Matai. So she asks, women in fragile settings are facing culturally influenced opposition, not only from the men alone, but from the women themselves. I think you already talked about this, so we mentioned this. Based on your research, what do you think is the best way to amplify emerging women voices in business, entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship space? So I think we, when answering to a previous question, we also answered this question. Do you have anything to add?
I think that, just to re-emphasize that role models are really important. So where women have succeeded in business and otherwise, that they are, that they are used as champions to support other women in business. They are recognized and appreciated within the community, and that they're part of, in a way, the movement for change. So it's really, in a way, drawing on those existing women, and even if they're from neighboring communities or from other environments, as long as they're not too, in Afghanistan, I have to give you an example. So if you bring people from the city to the village, they say, those people don't belong to us. And so you have to be careful about, to what extent role models. So if you bring women from a neighboring village, they'll say, oh, they are like us. Oh, Fatima, she did a business. She was involved in making jams and selling it. We can do that too. But when Afghan women were coming from the city in let's say civil society groups, and they were going into the village and talking about women's rights and in terms of access to education or other issues and health, etc., the women said to me, everyone in the village will hold their breath, wait for those women to go, and they say, those women, they don't belong to us, because they couldn't relate to them. They were so empowered. They were so different. So, it's drawing on relatable role models. So people who they can look to and say, yes, their life is similar to mine, but they've done it.
Yeah, and there is another part of Matai's question. So she asks, in this regard to international development, the UN's allocation to women-led or social enterprises that focus on women receive a small share. How can women business survive in this kind of environment where international funding is lacking?
You know, it's a very difficult question. I mean, I guess from an agency perspective, there has to be more lobbying. So at a higher level, more lobbying for funding. I would say that there is funding available at a micro level. The gap for me is often at the SME level. So it's going from micro business to medium-sized business, accessing larger loans and the skills. So I mentioned earlier about this personal initiative training. So some of these, what I call business plus training, that allows women to be able to have that, you know, as I say, confidence, ability, and self-belief, actually, that they can enter into business that's no longer just a micro business. Often micro business is seen to be more the domain of women. If you get a bigger business, and many cases around the world demonstrate that sometimes men come in and they take the business and they say, it's a big business, so now it belongs to us.
Yeah.
So you've got that issue. So for me, it's recognizing there is a bit of a gap in between. And there was one other thing about that, is that, you know, we talk about survivalist entrepreneurs. So these very small petty trader or small women involved in small business. And then you've got women that are really keen to be growing those businesses. And there's a huge distinction between them. And so I'm digressing a little bit, but I would like to say that for a lot of survivalist entrepreneurs, as it's termed, they are women and men that are involved in small business activities, but they're not really entrepreneurs as we would see it, and taking lots of risks. You know, if you think of a collection of people, maybe 10% of them are really what I'd call classically entrepreneurs. In many cases, the women said to me that, you know, yes, I'm trading, but if you gave me an opportunity tomorrow to join a business where I was just an employee, I would prefer to do that. So, you know, I think really it's more about choice and cultivating being entrepreneurial with your life, not just being an entrepreneur, but being entrepreneurial with your life. So that's about choice and opportunity. If you want to be an employee and work in a big organization, that's not a failure. If you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to be growing that business, that's a different type of venture. So I think recognizing these differences, not just pushing women to all be entrepreneurs. That's a really important point for me. Yeah. It's really about opening doors to economic opportunity.
Yeah, it's about giving options.
Yes.
Yeah.
Choice and options.
Choice and options. Yeah. I wanted to add to that. I agree totally with you. That from the International Development Organization's perspective, that sometimes they focus on numbers when they provide microcredits, like how many entrepreneurs they have financed, etc. I was doing research on SME access to finance for my master's thesis, but I came across with one international, it was regional development bank, that they were providing microfinance to women, also group of women entrepreneurs. So then I met and I saw their list and their report. It was so impressive, and they showed some cases that was so impressive. But then accidentally, so I met a group of women. It was 3 women who got microcredit from them. And when I asked what they are doing, they said that actually they don't own anything. The business was owned by in paper, on paper, it's owned by them, but in reality, it's run by husband of one of women in the group. So I think international development organizations and when providing microcredit, they should not focus on the quantity, but on quality. Also, as you said,
quality. It's a very important point you've made. Yeah, and also perhaps not emphasizing that all women have to be entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, for me, in a way, that was a revelation when I spoke to, I was working with Syrian refugees in northern Jordan, and looking at the way that they were organizing their lives to support their families. In this case, the men were not able to work. And the women before had lived in very rural households in southern part of Syria. They were on farms, etc. Some of them have been professionals, but of perhaps 5 to 10%. The rest of them were certainly not in business. They were running the farms, etc. And when they were in the context of Jordan, they had to start work to support the families. The men were not able to work because they were being deported. They started small businesses, for example, making sweets, selling it to neighbors, doing a little bit of hairdressing, anything that was a small economic venture. But when I spoke to them and we talked about the various constraints on women in the economy as refugees in Jordan, they said to me, without a doubt, what they were really looking for was actually the opportunity to be able to get a job, not just to be an entrepreneur. They said that we really just want a job. So I was trying to unravel that. It's like, oh, well, if you had access to finance and you had this and you could grow the business. And some of them said, look, I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I don't want to be a business person.
Yeah, because they want security sometimes.
Exactly. And they probably, in a sense, that's also mixed up with their idea around economic security. So a job would bring more economic security than a business. But taking that away, I still understood also that, that entrepreneurship isn't for everyone.
Yeah.
But economic opportunity is what we should look at.
Yes. Indeed. Last but not least, we have nice comments. Thank you all. And we have Matai herself. She wrote that my name is Matai. She's South Sudanese social entrepreneur based in Nairobi. I'm a founder of Tidy, a social entrepreneur startup based on women and youth in South Sudan. Our purpose is to bring out stories of emerging women entrepreneurs, organize them into a self-sustaining program so they can build the future. So she has shared her contacts with us, so I will make sure to share it with you.
That is great. I'd love to be connected.
Yeah, and also with our project team. So as a Coachability Foundation also, we also would like to connect with her. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Matai, we will check your LinkedIn and we will make sure to share your email address with Dr. Ritchie too. So let me check questions. So yeah, we don't have any other questions. We have nice comments. Thank you all for comments. Thank you very much, Dr. Ritchie, for your time, for your presentation and this mind-opening discussion with you. I myself enjoyed it a lot, and I am sure that our audience also enjoyed. We will make sure to share your presentation with our audience today we had, and so that they can check the links that you have shared. Also, they can check your research and your work in the field. I'm looking forward for another webinar actually with you, because I really enjoyed it. So,
well, perhaps next time we can look at refugee business and ICTs, so the role of ICTs, particularly for more marginalized groups, but also, as I say, including refugees in that. We don't often think of refugees and mobile devices, online business, and all of that. And it's really, really a critical part of the solution to opening up economic opportunity for them.
Yeah, I would love to discuss with you also that. So I also enjoyed reading your research on this topic, and I hope we will have another discussion on refugee entrepreneurs and ICT.
Great, and I would love to hear any comments or questions. I'm not sure if my email address has been shared, but if not, I'm sure you can do. I'm always love to hear feedback of people who've had either similar or different experiences, and also their reflections upon some of the thoughts I shared today.
Yeah. We'll also share this video. So we were recording this video. We'll share with all attendees, and also with those who registered for this webinar but couldn't attend. And also we'll make sure share your contact details with everyone.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Bye.
Bye.